let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you to our meeting today and express my appreciation for your time. Specifically today, this afternoon, as we're going to talk about some issues that are related to soft closures and accountability and assessment. Many of those, at least at the surface level, I think we have an awareness of, but there are some underlying issues that we hope this group will provide some healthy discussion around and also provide some guidance that we can take back to our board. Trying to consider if there's a way to do introductions through this that isn't too disruptive. I can't really think of a way, although I do want to talk about some of the protocols for the meeting. Each of you have the ability to unmute your mic. We have the chat feature on the right-hand side that you can use to have comment. So and there should be a functionality for you to raise your hand. So next to your name, you'll see your hand, and if you click on that, it'll raise your hand. That'll be another way you can indicate when you have a comment or input. So there'll be periods during the meeting where we'll pause and ask for specific feedback and dialogue, and we'll have some conversation. And if at any point during our meeting today, scheduled to go until 4 o'clock, and we'll try to hold hard on that stop, because if only for Scott Marion's benefit, since he has another immediately after. So again, for dialogue, we can use the chat feature. You can raise your hand, and then Emily, I think you can see everyone's hand on the list, and you can pause us and let us know. And then otherwise, you can always unmute and then just make a comment. We would ask that when we're not talking, that we'd leave our microphones muted so that we don't have too much background noise. So.
Hey, Darren, this is Scott. One thing I suggest for instead of introductions, just have everybody say hi in the chat. So Logan already did that, and Jennifer said something, but if everybody just says, hey, I'm here, and that way we have introductions.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. So we'll pause for just a minute for you to type in hello, or if there's any other salutation you'd like to offer today.
There we go.
Sorry, are we doing the introductions?
No, you're just typing in the chat.
Okay.
Oh. Good attendance. Okay.
The fastest intro ever.
Yeah. There were several of our committee members who've reached out to me, two specifically, that are involved in graduation activities in their respective LEAs this afternoon, and were unable to join. So we will be recording this meeting like we typically do, and then we'll make the recording link available to those who were not able to join us, who are part of our committee. And then also for those of you who are with us, if you'd like to review it at some point in the future. So you can see a high-level overview of our agenda today. We'll take a few minutes to talk about, I'll provide updates about actions that have been taken since the last AAPAC meeting in February 2020, some of the things that we need to consider, and then we'll roll into what we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about is the accountability implications of 2020 assessment and the accountability waivers that have been granted. And those waivers, we'll talk more in detail about those shortly. And then we'll try to wrap things up with talking about supports for our LEAs in the bridging recovery phases. And it'd be a great opportunity to get input from those of you who are working in our schools about some of those comments. We'll have Jennifer Thronston with us. I'll be presenting some information from our teaching and learning section as well. And then we'll conclude with making sure we have our next meeting on the calendar and potentially build up a draft, high-level draft of our next agenda. So, all right, let's go to the next slide, please. And actually the next one. back one. So when we met in February, there were several things that we talked about. If you can go back once, there we go. Several things that we talked about, and I just wanted to follow up and let you know what was the outcome of the work product that you participated in. We spent some time talking about our concurrent enrollment calculation for our post-secondary readiness indicator. We showed examples of some of the LEAs who, even though they're affiliated with universities and all their students take concurrent enrollment classes at some point during their high school career, the way that their schedule is built in their high schools didn't meet the threshold of earning 1 credit for the class. Aaron Bruff and Data Statistics did a good job, I thought, of providing examples of that. So the committee made a recommendation that we reduce that the board reduce that to a 0.5 threshold, as long as the credits within the 0.5 were all the same course, same concurrent enrollment course. Our board approved that recommendation, and so we've begun moving forward with implementing that for the coming school year. We also talked about developing an assessment strategic plan, and we'll spend some more specific time talking about that. That work is beginning to advance. We'll talk about what role we believe the Assessment Accountability Committee should play in that, in addition to the mechanisms for getting feedback from a wider range of stakeholders and provide opportunities from our citizens from around the state to be able to weigh in on that. It's one of the more exciting things I think that's going on right now. One of the things we spent quite a bit of time on was this Effective Teachers in High Poverty Schools Incentive Program. If you remember, that program has existed for a few years, and it was connected to a teacher's student growth percentile, the median growth percentile of being a certain threshold, and then if they were teaching in particular schools, they could receive additional compensation. So there are a few variables there. There was also, I believe, Representative Winder ran a bill at the same time we were talking about this issue to include teachers in the early grades and using the Dibble scores or Acadian scores to be able to demonstrate that they're highly effective. As we got done talking about that, we went back and looked at the statute more closely, and it requires, in the statute itself, it requires that the score come from a state standards assessment or the Acadians now, based on the revision to the legislation in 2020. What our discussion was focused on is with the change of moving the RISE, or our state standards test, from grades 3 through 10 down to 3 through 8. We spent a lot of time talking about what would be the right way to handle the 9th and 10th grade. The fact that the statute is clear on the language makes the discussion we had immaterial, so no additional action was taken on that. Any questions about follow-up from our last time we met? And Emily, I'll count on you to monitor the hand raising. Again, the rest of you feel comfortable as well to use the chat or just to unmute yourself and offer comment. All right, so go ahead. Yeah, or at least call on them and confirm that they have a question or a comment.
Yeah, it looks like Janet and Leanne have questions. So Janet, why don't you go ahead? You should be unmuted now.
All right, thank you. I just had a question about effective teachers in these schools. I believe that when we were looking through budget cuts and reductions, that program was one of the ones that was potentially on the chopping block. And I wondered if you have an update on whether or not that is still a viable program, if that is that something we'll still be able to use. Do you know the status of it in terms of budget cuts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Board Member Cannon. You're correct. That was on the list of, and I guess let me back up for a minute so those who maybe haven't been involved get some context of what you and I are discussing. The state legislature, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, has directed all state agencies to to plan on moving forward on their base budget. And so all the legislative changes that were implemented in 2020 that had funding associated with those, they made it pretty clear early on that we shouldn't expect those funds. And then they came to all state government. So the State Board of Education is one of those, UDOT, Highway Patrol, all the other entities in the state, and they gave them a directive that's been done in the past, sometimes as a procedure or process. This year, there's obviously more emphasis on it because it's more likely that some level of cuts will be impacted or be affected. And they asked the state agencies to identify what they would need to cut if they had a 2% budget cut off the base budget going into fiscal year 21, a 5% cut, and then also a 10% cut to the base budgets. And so what Board Member Cannon's speaking about is staff, the board directed staff to go through programs and try to figure out at which threshold would various programs need to be cut. There were some directions we were given to make sure that we respected the board strategic plan and how to filter on that as staff, and then also to look for what programs are essential or deemed essential, which programs are helpful but not essential. And again, there's some subjectivity, obviously, in these kind of discussions. And also to look for programs that might be duplicative in nature, or there's some other way to meet the basic needs that are being fulfilled by that program. So the program for highly effective teachers, I think the budget line on that was around $250,000 annually. Teachers in schools in the program. It's a relatively small number of teachers that are impacted by that, and it doesn't cause them to lose their employment, and so they maintain their employment. We also wanted to try to maintain the integrity of the FTE as much as possible. As I think everyone on this call knows, education is a people business, and the vast majority of expenses in education has to do with salaries and benefits for employees across the state, teachers specifically. So that was listed there. This morning, when the Appropriations Subcommittee met, they were going through those recommendations. In addition, the LFA at the legislative level, their team made recommended cuts, and then also the Utah School Boards Association and Utah School Superintendents Association submitted a list of cuts. I can't remember where this came out, but I can tell you, Board Member Cannon, that this item was singled out by a representative or a senator on the committee and voted to remove it from the list, along with two other programs that impact Title I schools. They were not able to complete their work this morning, and so they'll schedule another committee meeting before it goes to executive appropriations. But I apologize, Board Member Cannon. I cannot remember the status other than it was pulled. There was someone that was concerned about that and two other programs that were impacting Title I schools. One thing that they did talk about, though, is that as they remove the funding from these programs, if they need to, that the legislation's not going away, that it'll just be on pause or hiatus until funding can be restored. That was a general discussion among the members of the Appropriations Sub-Appropriations Committee.
Hey, Darren, Leanne Wood also had a question, I believe.
Actually, no, for some reason my hand was just raised when I entered the room, so okay. I'm good, sorry.
Just eager to hit that buzzer. Okay,
that's
good.
Right.
All right.
Okay, thank you. So we met the end of February 2020, and less than a month later, our schools were directed to be on soft closure, and things changed dramatically for us into a world and a setting that we're not familiar with, uncharted waters, surrounded by, as our board chair described this morning, surrounded by a fog of uncertainty. But immediately action started to be taken around waivers. Our board on the 19th of March suspended statewide assessments in their meeting. The U.S. Department of Education, just about a week later, offered and agreed or accepted Utah's request for a waiver of assessment, accountability and school identification, and certain report card provisions. Not all. There are some things we'll still need to report out under the requirements of the United States Department of Education. And then on the 22nd of April, the Utah legislature in one of their special sessions waived statewide assessments, their requirement for it, and then also the basic civics test requirement for graduation. They allowed LEAs to submit waivers on behalf of students who were unable to fulfill that requirement. So that's a lot of work that happened really quickly, and it's from my perspective very impressive at how fast these entities, these organizations that typically are not able to be that agile and move that quickly, especially the United States Department of Education, and how quickly we're able to be responsive. So we're operating under those waivers currently, and those waivers will go into this coming year in terms of the accountability, school identification, report card provisions. We'll talk more about those moving forward. Understand, though, that the suspension of assessments was defined to this year. If there's a need for additional waivers, obviously at the state or federal level, those issues will be addressed. But we're moving forward today as though assessment will be back in play this coming year, and we'll seek guidance and we'll have discussion around the issues related to that premise. So if you'll go to the next slide. I just want to spend a couple of moments. This information is available on the Utah State Board of Education's website across the top. The coronavirus links. There's a lot of information on this site, and I encourage people I communicate with to regularly review and visit this site. But this generally points out the phases that the State Board of Education is working under. And we're transitioning into phase 2, the bridge learning gaps. The near future is here. Most schools have completed their instruction for the year and are making plans moving forward of how to put in contingency plans for what the fall will look like. And then return and reimagine is the next step. So if you go to the next 2 slides, I'm going to pull out or call out which parts of these recovery elements are directly related to the work that we do, or our function that we serve. So those 4 bullets indicate things related to the bridging phase of recovery. And I've underlined use formative assessments to determine gaps in learning. That's a really broad and general statement, but it at least highlights the importance of understanding what students know and can do to be able to develop the learning progressions for them moving forward into the new year in a new instructional setting. If you go to the next slide. As we get to the reimagining, return and reimagining, that's directly called out in our plan that we use assessments as a formative tool in the fall to assess these learning gaps and set baselines for the 2021 school year. And again, so that's the context of what we're going to be talking about today, at least a portion of our conversation. Are there questions about the phases of recovery or what we've discussed to this point? Okay, well, we'll move into talking about the assessment strategic plan. This is what we had initiated in our meeting in February, and it's something again that I feel a lot of excitement about this to develop and create a guiding document that the State Board of Education can use moving forward to try to accomplish these goals that are listed here as well. So there's really two phases or 2 prongs to what we're trying to accomplish. Our standards assessment, which is also known as the RISE, for grades 3 through 8, is considered by some to be kind of the foundational assessment piece in our state. It serves the largest number of students. It's a criterion referenced. It's got a number of tools associated with it, and the data is used in lots of different ways. That contract we have right now with Cambian Assessment, which was previously AIR, they were purchased by Cambian, and we've talked about that before. It goes through the spring of 2022. So we, as staff for the state board, want to begin writing the RFP this fall and release it late fall or early winter in 20 or 21. So we hope that this strategic plan will help inform some of the elements of the writing that RFP process, to take into consideration things that we might not have currently written into, or elements of that assessment that we could find ways to enhance or improve that, to make it meet the needs of the various stakeholders that use that assessment. And then the other prong is that we're interested in looking forward or into the future to really lay out a plan or vision of making sure that we have a balanced assessment system in the state of Utah, that we can take into account the work that's going on under Portrait of a Graduate and personalized competence-based learning, to ensure that assessment is not a barrier to the innovation that's taking place in our education systems in the state of Utah. So that's the second piece of that process. We'll go to the next slide. And Scott, I might ask you to talk a little bit about this, because you have your organization and you personally have been involved in this work with other states. And I know we talked about it as a group in February. Maybe you can remind us a little bit about the context and the parameters around this type of work.
Sure. Thanks, Darren. And we've employed this process, the evolving process, in several states in similar contexts to what Utah is thinking about now, with this need for reissuing an RFP later this year to try to get a contract in place to meet the federal and state required assessment needs, but also because there are these other interests in the state to think about how to expand and perhaps balance or rebalance assessment systems. So one of the things, as Jared and Sid know, so does Darren, that we coordinate the technical issues and large-scale assessment SCAS group, State Collaborative Group, for the Council of Chief State School Officers. A lot of acronyms in there. And we're always struck by the turnover in state assessments systems. You know, we'd go around the meeting and people would say, oh, I'm on my 4th assessment in 5 years as a state assessment director. And someone else will say, heck, I'm on my 5th one in 4 years. I wish I was making that up, but Jared and Sid could tell you that's the truth. So one of the things we found is, by getting this group of stakeholders that includes everyone from the classroom to the State House involved in helping to clarify the state's values and to actually put forth a framework for assessment, design, and implementation, creates tremendous buy-in. We've done this in Wyoming, Oklahoma, Alabama, New Mexico, and South Dakota. I listed Iowa there. Iowa went through a similar process. We weren't involved in that one. And I call it the Noah's Ark collection of education stakeholders, 2 superintendents, 2 principals, 2 teachers, et cetera. And depending on the state, you shouldn't do it with fewer than 20 people. And we've done it with as many as 50 or 60 stakeholders. And it's work. And actually we'll see on the next slides that Darren changed the name to work group, because it really is a work group. People have to roll up their sleeves. They have to do some reading. They have to do some deliberation. They have to be committed to read sections of a report. But what you end up with is a report that helps to memorialize the deliberations and recommendations. So these are kinds of things that if, let's say, a legislator says, hey, I have a constituent complaining about the state assessment system, I want to change it, it's easy to refer them to say, well, look what this group did. We weighed in on this report. We got a lot of stakeholder input. What we see here, and I would point you especially, so I think I'm sure we'll send the slides out later, but if these are live links. The New Mexico one is probably the most similar context in a sense to what you guys are thinking about, because this is structured in terms of 2 phases. And phase 1 is to meet the immediate federal and state required assessment needs. And phase 2 is looking for a vision to the future of what could assessment be 5 plus years down the line. So like I said, once we send this out, you'll be able to link to these things, or just go prowl around on the center's website. And then I'm going to turn this back to Darren now.
So one of the, as the Center for Assessment helps us develop a scope of work and create a timeline, backwards designed to try to get this work completed by the end of October 2020 is our general scope. The step that USB staff is engaged in right now under guidance from the Center for Assessment, because they've done this work in other states, and then also feedback from this group, is the membership of what this group should look like. We have the Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee. The voting members of this committee who are with us today, you have been appointed by the Utah State Board of Education. We have a little bit of a Noah's Ark already that Scott Marion talked about. A couple superintendents, a couple teachers. We have elementary, high school principals, charter school. We try to have representation to help us keep the lens on equity and so forth. So there's some discussion or decision around what role should the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee serve in this. Should the members of AAPAC just be part of a larger group? Should they be an executive committee for the work group? Keeping in mind that in addition to the work group, we anticipate having 4 public gatherings or opportunities across the state for the public to be involved, specifically to come in just to get feedback, much like we do when the State Board of Education adopts new standards associated with the courses. So I'm open for discussion, and hopefully this group will provide some guidance to us at this time. So just think about that for a second, remembering that when you volunteered to participate in AAPAC and accepted the nomination and appointment by the board, you might not have considered the amount of work that could be associated with this type of project to being part of your commitment. And I understand that everyone is very busy to that. And Scott could probably talk to, if you have questions about the specifics, about the type and amount of work that would be involved, if you functioned as a member of the work group, or even if we establish an executive committee and then a group that outside of the executive committee. So I'm going to pause, giving you some things to think about and accept comments and feedback about that, and also direction or guidance that some of you might feel.
This is board member Earl. Can I weigh in, or do I need to, is there anything I need to wait on?
Yeah, board member.
Want people to weigh in?
Okay.
Yeah,
I actually have a couple of questions. I know that ESSA is up for reauthorization this year. It seems to me that there could be built into that some flexibility for our assessments moving forward, provided Congress actually gets to that, right? But I think with minimal changes, we could be asking for some flexibility in that area, and I think that's a wise direction to go. And then I just have some general statements or questions, actually, if someone could answer those. Instead of doing a state mandated one type of assessment, are any of these other states looking at doing, I know Arizona has done this, where they're looking at allowing a district to make that decision based on the way they would like to do assessments. There's a variety of assessments out there currently, and allowing them the flexibility to use those assessments that are available, and then they would be providing, this is how we're meeting the needs of our students. So that's just a general question. Of course, we'd have to have federal change to laws and probably state laws too. But where we're looking at changing, moving forward, and having to redo a contract, it would seem that if we're moving towards a competency-based element, we might want to carry on that dialogue sooner than later and begin to move that way. That's my first question. So I'll let you answer that, and then I have another one. So.
Okay, so let me offer some comments, and then Scott or Dr. Marion might also have some things to say. It is relevant that you connected those two things together, because ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act, does have some requirements around assessments that Arizona found they were not able to be compliant with, and so they did move forward with trying to. When I say they, the legislature in Arizona directed their Department of Education to offer a menu of assessments. They received direction from the federal government that was not compliant with federal law. So they had to, it's my understanding, they had to turn that around pretty quickly. There are some contexts where menus are available or acceptable. So for instance, in Utah, where we have a college readiness assessment, the ACT has been selected as that tool. It's my understanding that within the federal guidelines, you could offer a menu in that arena where the SAT or ACT could be available. But in terms of our state standards tests, measuring math and science, math and language arts particularly, but science in various grades, you're right that it would require some flexibility within ESSA that doesn't currently exist if we were to go with a menu option. The other challenge with offering a menu of assessments, there are, as you know, and I think most of us on this call know, there's lots of vendors in the assessment world, what we call off-the-shelf assessments that you can buy from them. NWEA is one that I think you've heard us as staff reference recently in terms of the summer learning loss and the expected COVID learning loss. But there's a number of others. Ensuring that the assessments are aligned with the standards that the state has identified that they want to be taught in their classrooms, that becomes more challenging when you start purchasing assessments off the shelf. Scott, do you have some comments to add?
Yeah, Darren. So board member Cannon's raising, good. It wasn't Cannon. I'm sorry. I was raising a good question. And so first of all, let's go to the ESSA reauthorization. She's right that it's scheduled to be reauthorized in 2021. For those who have long enough memories will know that No Child Left Behind was scheduled to be reauthorized in 2008, and it was finally reauthorized in December 2015. I've been working with a group of folks trying to put forth policy papers and others and trying to build advocacy communities around some of these ideas around flexibility. I've been very involved in the innovative assessment world. And we're going through that process because frankly, I think we got caught flat-footed the last time. But I don't think any of us have any realistic hope that they'll start serious reauthorization discussions anytime soon. But it's good to be prepared and not caught flat-footed. The kind of use of, I'll just call them interim assessments that districts use as a state summative assessment. Darren's right, it's not allowed under ESSA, but I think that's exactly the kinds of things that this work group or task force would discuss. And because one of the things that we are always learning, these hard lessons in our world, is, whenever something looks good, there's usually some unintended consequence that you don't quite see right away. And so by having these discussions, and it's true for any policy instrument, so having these discussions in this group of, 30, 40, 50 people, you're able to bring forth what the group wants. So maybe the thing the group really wants is to be able to build more balanced systems of assessments that better support teaching and learning in the classrooms. And so there might be a lot of ways to get there other than just buying off-the-shelf assessments, for instance. So that's exactly why you have a group like this to do that? See a few other hands raised as well. So that was Jeannie Earl. So Janet Cannon, Board Member Cannon, have a question?
Yes. Thank you. So if I understand correctly what you've said, the idea of this work group would be to do some work towards this bullet you have about supporting a personalized competency-based education, innovative education systems, and a balanced system of assessment. I'm just wondering if you could comment for me on how competency-based relates to assessment. Is competency-based always just, well, you can do this and you can't do that? Is so kind of a pass fail? Or is there a way for someone to really excel in a competency-based system and have that their excellence noted? Commenting on that for me.
Yeah, Board Member Cannon. That's so I've been heavily involved in because competency is ultimately an assessment question. If I want to declare that Darren is competent at something, I have to in some way assess his knowledge and skills, right? So it is an assessment question. I've been involved in this world for a long time, in the competency-based world. If you ask me to define a competency, I would struggle. It is a little bit of a Rorschach test for a lot of people, but the reality is what it's really trying to do, and states approach this differently, is define, and where it becomes a state initiative, these bigger ideas that we want kids to be able to leave high school with, be able to think critically, communicate effectively, understand global issues, persist when faced with challenging tasks, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of people look at competencies in those bigger ideas, those cross-cutting concepts. Others do it in a finer grained thing for a course level. At a course level, at a finer grade level, they look a lot like content standards, but I think where many people are thinking about them as these bigger ideas around what's often been termed profile of a graduate. And so it's a way of reframing the education system a little bit to point to that, as opposed to everybody just going through and taking their courses and passing their courses. Everybody in the school system is pointing towards making sure kids understand the content of their courses, but they're also working on these big cross-cutting concepts. I see Jennifer's on. She might want to speak to this as well.
Yeah, Scott, I think you hit the nail on the head. It is kind of a broad space, and so kind of thinking through ours, we currently only test competency to some level of definition of competency in ELA, math, and science from a high-level overview, but there are other things that we want to measure at smaller grain size, as well as other content areas we might want to deem competency in. And so as we are working in the competency development right now, we have the 13 elements from Import to a Graduate. Many of those don't have measures that we could use to help determine competency. So as we kind of head down this space, it's uncharted, but we'll be developing and kind of making our way together as we go through this. Having a group work on this to really focus and make sure we're intentional and thoughtful about the types of assessments, I think is really great, and I appreciate this team deciding that needs to happen. And in terms of like who makes up that work group, people involved in the digital teaching and learning and the competency-based, more the competency-based grants program, those LEAs are already kind of in this space and headed down this pathway. So I think I saw someone from Davison and maybe DUAB. They have really started to head down this space in great ways, and we've got some charters as well that have, and so some of those folks might be really nice to have in this assessment work group that you're thinking of developing.
Thanks, Jennifer. Darren, it looks like Ashley Anderson has a hand up.
Hi, thank you. I am hearing that the work group is really significant commitment, so I just wanted to add that I think there should be some mechanism to get feedback from a more critical mass of teachers at a lower commitment level. And part of that is because in my experience working across a couple of districts, as an arts specialist. Not all district cultures really equally encourage teachers to voice concerns or ideas about assessments, but teachers do have really strong opinions, obviously, about areas where maybe they're over-assessing or getting ineffective information. And I think that there has to be some low-stakes way that teachers in really large numbers can give their perspective that sort of counteracts that climate. And that in creating some kind of mechanism for getting feedback from teachers, it could look at teachers who support assessed subjects, but don't necessarily get the credit. So like in all Utah schools, BTS specialists or district music specialists lead huge portions of the academic core in the year, but they're not necessarily always included in the assessment piece, but would have, a lot of information about how those assessments impact their students and how what they provide relates to the results that we're getting.
So that's, Darren, you want to talk about these community conversations or?
Yeah, let me jump in. I like what I hear you saying, Ashley, and what I'm wondering is if part of the work group then, part of this outreach effort that we would make would be developing is when you say low stakes way to give input, are you referring to something like a survey mechanism?
Yeah, I just mean some way that people would feel confident saying how they really feel. I feel like sometimes teachers complete a survey or participate informally in like one public conversation, but they don't really feel confident or empowered across districts to say what they actually think would be beneficial.
Okay, so again, traditionally the way we do that is you can have community meetings or opportunities to gather, and in this case it might be gathering through technology like we are today or through surveys. Is there a mechanism separate from those two that you're inferring, or would those two ways meet your criteria?
I think that meets the criteria. I also think that if there is sort of an executive committee or some established mechanism by which members of the work group make it their prerogative to get feedback from a certain number of teachers. Like, I just know that if I called 10 teachers, for instance, I might hear something really different than I get back on a survey. So I don't really have the answer. I'm just sort of posing the thought that, like, how do you get a critical mass of teacher results that are really authentically representative?
Yeah, it's a great question, including getting feedback from our parent group, especially some of our parents who don't traditionally connect with the education system or feel ostracized or alienated in some way. Well, Scott, I've taken too much time on this. As I've watched the chat box and as I've listened to the conversations, I'm going to propose that the AAPAC members will play a key role. They'll be part of the work group, or at least have the opportunity to be such. My current position would be that I would reach out to each AAPAC member once we have a schedule of events, more details about the amount of work, and see if you're willing to keep that kind of commitment. And then we'll continue to increase the scope of that work group, probably into the 30 participant range, and then move forward with our work that way. Is that something that this group could support? And I guess what you could do is just raise your hand if you can support that motion.
Or just put it in the chat, either way. Yeah,
or in the chat.
Yeah, that's all. A lot of positives. Great.
Okay, great.
And you get to hang out with me and Darren more, so it's a win-win. So.
Okay, so I'm going to turn the time over to Scott, and I think Michelle, and Leslie might be involved in this next segment.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to get us started, then pass the ball. So we're going to talk about, as everybody knows, right, assessment stopped, but once assessment stopped, that meant accountability stopped for the current year. But one of the things, let me move this chat box. Brent, just to answer your question about legislators, that's actually something we have talked about, getting a couple of legislators on board as well. If I put my chat box there, does that cover the screen for anyone else or no? Did anybody see my chat? No?
No.
Okay, good. All right. So we have the on this little table we created, we have all of the indicators: achievement, growth, EL progress, growth of the lowest 25%, and then I broke out the post-secondary readiness. This is obviously the top 4 for elementary and middle school, and then the last one is for high school, is post-secondary readiness, which includes graduation, ACT, and readiness coursework. So 2020, the year we're in now, spring 2020, as you could see, no data is the modal response for any of these, except for the WIDA test, the Access 2.0. You guys, Yeoman's efforts, were able to complete testing for the EL kids. So you're able to get all those data, and that means progress calculations can occur to see how kids are moving along that WIDA scale. In terms of post-secondary readiness, and this be worth having the AAPAC's feedback for you guys closest to this, we're assuming that you're still going to be able to produce graduation rate. You know, kids aren't having in-person graduations, but they're still graduating, and they're still taking readiness type coursework, the kind of coursework that counts for the readiness indicator. And then, as we know, ACT canceled its administration for this spring. So, right, we don't have those data, so it becomes hard to do that indicator. There's no requirement that the accountability system, federal accountability system, and state accountability systems were waived for 2020, so that's not the issue. But once we got past that, lots of us started thinking about, well, what about 2021? So we've been working. Yes.
Can I make a comment about graduation and readiness coursework for 2020?
Yeah.
For us, we've both of those are lagged a year. So our reporting for 2020 will be the 2019 graduating cohort and the readiness coursework that cohort participated in. So there's really no impact for 2020. That impact will really occur in 2021 when we're looking at the 2020 grad cohort. When we get to an appropriate point, I have some questions for AAPAC about graduation.
Okay.
Please continue.
Yes. So that's a good point. I think Board Member Cannon, if you could go on mute, that would help. Hearing a lot of typing. So in that's okay. In 2021, we'll have the, again, we don't know how 2021 school year is going to roll out. Many of us have been trying to think through, as you guys are, as you're trying to think about how do you reopen schools in the fall, thinking about multiple scenarios, right? If we roll the dice and get lucky, kids will start school in the fall and the year will progress normally. Many of us are worried at that being a low probability. So we have to think about a variety of either interruptions or remote learning or social distancing that would affect the education. But even if kids go to school next year, quote unquote, normally, we'll be assessing, let's say, 5th graders at the end of 2021 who've likely missed a decent amount of 4th grade. And we trust our teachers are going to do a great job trying to fill holes and not try to reteach everything from 4th grade. But it does raise questions about the interpretability of the achievement indicator next year. Growth, we'll be talking in more detail about growth shortly, so I won't spoil that prize. But, you know, as I always say to people, the computer doesn't care. If you give it numbers, it'll spit out a growth calculation. Whether the prior assessment comes from 2019 or 2020, it'll give you a calculation. It's the interpretations that we have to talk about, and Leslie and Anne Michelle talk about that more. For the EL progress, again, now we do have these complete data. Assuming we get complete data next year, we could do the calculations, but do we interpret them in the same way if kids have been out of school and learning remotely? the growth of the lowest 25% has the same issues with the regular growth. And then if all goes well, we'll be able to have these various grad requirements, as post-secondary readiness requirements. Given what Anne Michelle just said about the lagging, that means the graduation rate indicator would be based on data from this current year that we're in, as would the readiness coursework. And so we'd look to you to say, you know, are those trustworthy values? Should they be taken with a grain of salt? And then we hope that things are really truly back to normal in 2021-2022 school year, and we should be able to move forward in full confidence with the accountability indicators. Now, before anybody asks, I'll cut you off. There has been no waiver of accountability in 2021, but it's still too early to even think about that. And so we have to proceed as if we will potentially have accountability, certainly federal accountability. So with that, I want to turn this over. Logan said he doesn't know how to raise his hand, but he's got a question. So, well,
there's a button somewhere on my screen. I just got to know.
That is totally why Sherry is much cooler than you. But
significantly cooler, no doubt whatsoever. Nobody in this room is going to dispute it. So I know where to unmute my microphone. I know where that button is. Here's my question, Scott. Have we done any? I echo some of the concerns about growth that Hal put in the thread.
Yeah.
But have we done any kind of looks? Could we go back and say we had growth data for the spring of 2019? We know how that calculated with the 17-18 data as the baseline for group establishment. Could we ignore the 17-18 data, recalculate the 19 growth, and see how different they are? To see how broken that would be in terms of just some impact data that would give us a ballpark on, yeah, we're okay with that much differential or not?
I know that there was I know the answer to that question
too.
Yeah, I know the answer to that question, but I know that Leslie and Anne Michelle are going to talk about that, so I don't want to spoil their fun. But that's exactly the kind of analyses that we look to. But Leslie will be able to talk to you more because Damien's been doing some work in this area.
Okay, great. I'll sit tight.
Okay. So Anne Michelle, you're up.
Yeah, so this is mostly a timeline version of what you just saw. We had a somewhat interesting year in 2019 with Rise in Utah Aspire Plus implementation. We did that initial results validation in the spring and published report cards. Then you can see in the dotted line the spring 2020 school dismissal. We don't expect to have assessment data for receiving that back in the summer of 2020. So we do plan to release the report card. I'll talk about that next because there are certain elements that do not fall under the federal waiver, but we will publish what data we have, and that will be on the next slide. So moving forward into the future, we expect that Rise in Utah Aspire Plus will be reinstated in 2020, 2021. We'll need to conduct a growth analysis, which will go into further detail. Logan, you're right on point. And comparing this strange gap year calculation to a prior, say, simulated gap year. And then work toward releasing a report card in fall of 2021. But growth requiring a prior year, depending on if that growth analysis and what we find, there may be a potential reset of baseline for growth for that year. So we expect real full return to accountability confidence to be in 2021, 2022, where we have 2 years of growth that we can calculate with with confidence. Rich has a great question about any plan to connect and analysis, learning loss, impact that could be attributed to school dismissal. I think a lot of people have interest in that. A lot of people are making predictions currently. It would be interesting to see how we could look at that within our own state. If you look along the bottom, that dotted line, there are some interesting policy implications to consider. CSI, so part of the federal waiver essentially had three parts. There were the assessments, the assessment waiver that waived the requirements for states to administer statewide assessments. The second part was the waiver for accountability. And then the third part was some assurances that states, when they applied for that waiver, they had to agree to a few different things. One of those was that they would hold CSI and TSI status constant through 2021. It would not identify, states would not identify new CSI or TSI schools. That would just hold constant through 2021 and sort of shift the timeline for identification out 1 year. So that's one consideration. Another one is that in the legislative session, the legislature determined that we would not assign letter grades on the report card that is currently published, the 2019 report card, but also that this was sort of serendipitous that there would be no letter grade for 2020. So I added in that 2021, we'll have to look closely at the appropriateness of assigning letter grades based on what data we have, what information is available in that year, and what occurs between now and the time for assessment in 2021. And then 2022 is the year that CSI and TSI determinations are reinstated. Again, looking closely at the data to make sure that those determinations are appropriate and reliable, but just things to consider along the way in this timeline. So you can go to the next slide. Leslie, do you want to go ahead and talk about Damien's blog post? Okay.
Sure, I can do that. And can everyone hear me, first of all? Yeah? Ooh, it's silent. I don't know.
You're good. You're good, Leslie.
Oh, okay, good. Scared me a little bit. Yeah, I think a lot of the questions being brought up in the chat are already getting to this. So it's almost like nothing here. I'm old news now in terms of what I'm presenting here. But still, I think that means a lot of you have obviously been thinking a lot about this. And certainly at the center, we've been thinking about this. Many of you know Damien Biederberger and Adam Van Alden. They're really kind of at the forefront of thinking about this. And there's actually a blog post on our website, and the link is here. So when you get this presentation later, I highly recommend you read this. What I've attempted to do is summarize some of the key points from their blog post, and many of you have already gotten to some of the analyses that they're suggesting or some of the things to look at. So this is great. Hopefully this will address some of your questions, but also inspire you to provide some feedback into what specifically should be done for Utah. So first of all, what Damien and Adam note in their blog is that this idea of a gap year is not new, although this is definitely unprecedented. There have been situations in which there have been gap years. They note the situation of the New England Common Assessment Program, or NECAP, when they transitioned to PARC. There was a 1.5-year gap between when it was given in the fall of 2013 and 15. We often see end-of-course assessments where we're looking at students' growth across not consecutive years, but multiple years. I think this often does happen in areas like science or social studies. And really, when there's transitions, like Utah has gone through in recent years with the transitioning between assessment programs, with vendors, or change in content standards, there is often this consideration of whether the growth value still matters. So these are definitely things that would happen before, but definitely not the scope that it's happened this time with the COVID-19 situation. So next slide, Scott. And I do see a lot of questions. The chat window keeps popping up. So if there's something I should stop, maybe Scott, you can stop me to answer your questions.
Yeah, I'm responding in the chat and monitoring. So you keep going. I'll let you know.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. All right, teamwork. So Scott actually already talked about this, which is actually one of the key questions key things to think about when it comes to growth measures. Like you said, the computer doesn't care, right? And really, if you give it some numbers, it'll crunch out. It can give you a growth value. And so when we think about growth considerations, we often want to think about two distinct issues, which is the analytical component, which is can a measure be calculated? And this is the part where, yeah, the computer, again, as long as you give it a formula, you set up it properly, it can give you a number. I think the more important question is what Damien and Adam called the use component is. Is that number valid? Is it valid or defensible to use that number? So should we use it? And typically, the first part is often obviously sometimes easier to answer than the second part. And to kind of bring this into the Utah context, we know that testing was suspended in spring 2020. So next year's growth measure, if we're going to compute it, will have to be based on 2 years of growth. And I think, Logan, you were suggesting this is perhaps, what do we typically see in 2 years of growth? And so one thing that Damien and Adam are suggesting is, and of course, it's possible to compute it, right? It's no problem once we get assuming assessment occurs next year, once we get the assessment data, we can run the student growth percentile analyses and then implement the growth model like it was before, just using 2 years of data. So the analytical component is no problem. But the question is, should we use it like we do the 1 year measure? And there needs to be a rationale why or why not. Next slide. So to answer that question, we probably want to do things that kind of have already been sort of suggested in the chat window. Logan, you just verbalized one particular idea, is we can try to look at what's happened in the past. Now, the challenge, of course, right now is we don't know what the actual impact of COVID-19 will be on student learning and achievement. We can speculate, and there's certainly been many hypotheses about what's going to occur, but the truth is we don't know what we don't know. So because this is unprecedented in scope, there's so many questions that have to be answered. But one way we can do is start planning it. And this is the one, if there's one takeaway from Adam and Damien's blog, it's like we should start the planning now. So this is very kind of timely that we're bringing this up now because, again, it's still be a while before we get any data. But still, you can start looking at things that happened in the past. So one thing you can do is actually, I think exactly what you suggested, Logan, is go back to 2018. And there's a reason we jumped over 2019 because there's some other confounding factors looking at growth in 19. So if you go back to 2018 and look at what was the growth measures like back there with 1 year growth, and what would have looked like if you had used 2 years of growth? So go back to so look at what the growth was between 16 to 18 compared to what was between 17 and 18. And that gives you a sort of a frame of reference or a benchmark to look at. And just for further validation, do the same analysis for 16 and 17. Now, the nice thing that Utah has going for itself is you have had the STAGE program around and you've been computing these growth values all these years. And so it is actually something that is actually, for Utah at least, kind of easy to look into to at least establish an idea of what 2 year growth looks like compared to 1 year growth. And then comes the key question, how different would the 2021 results have to look to make accountability use questionable? So again, there could be you may want to establish some criteria a priori to kind of establish that so that you're not trying to tell data stories, as we often say later on. So it is something to think about now once you start doing some analyses. And of course, we would probably do this analysis for all students, but also we want to do it, at different, aggregated to the school and district level, and also looking at it by different student groups and school types as well. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to you thinking about accountability use, and this I think gets more, at least before I started presenting, I was looking at a question that Rich had asked about potentially using these type of analyses to really inform policy and really help us to find out really what is the extent of the learning loss, and not only for the overall student group, but more importantly for various student groups. So this is actually where analysis of growth, in addition to thinking about it for accountability use, can be used to help inform policy. And some of the ideas that Damien and Adam bring up in their in their blog include, for instance, looking at historically, what two-year mean SGPs look like before for different student groups, and what do they look like for now. One other idea that's kind of not really inside this blog, but it's something I've heard in other discussions and attending other state TAC meetings, is that it could be that we may not even want to look at the idea of student groups. We may need to rethink that, because we have the traditional student groups in terms of, for instance, ethnicity and gender and socioeconomic status with specific variables, how you define that. But the impact of this COVID-19 crisis may not fall along those lines. So it could be one of those analyses where you also consider different types of grouping variables for students so that you can better pinpoint where the impacts are, and using the growth analysis to kind of help inform that. And so that's another idea that we may want to consider. Another idea is to look at different cohorts. So look more longitudinally, seeing how growth has typically occurred with 2 or 3 cohorts in the past, and compare that to what the growth trajectory or cohort looks like for the 2021 cohort, to see how different this is. And again, you can do this also at the overall student level, but also at a subgroup level as well. Next slide, please. Yeah. Some other ideas that they mentioned in the blog post is, obviously, if you want to kind of start with some more immediate data, is to consider using any data you can collect from fall 2020. So, right after the students, if school is back in session and you're able to administer those results from the interim benchmarks to kind of give you a preview of which groups are most affected. And this can actually help immediately inform interventions. And of course, I think earlier, the EL progress measure, Scott mentioned this, that we are able to administer the access this year. But because of that, it's data collected from before COVID-19 occurred. And so really the impact on that particular indicator may not manifest itself until the 2021 results. So you may want, so definitely want to have a plan in place to look at 2019-2020 EL growth compared to that in 2020 and 2021, because really it could be lagging in the sense that the impact on the EL population, especially in terms of the loss of EL services, will actually be shown in next year's data. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is kind of where I guess that's a really kind of high-level summary of what the blog post is about. And really, here's a couple of questions that, and I'm sure this is actually already going on in the chat window that I'm aware of, but some of the questions we just wanted to pose to the AAPAC would be, what results from any kind of USB-led analysis regarding the growth measure for accountability use in 2021 would help you feel comfortable about using it. And what we want to point out is, remember that growth, there's several elements inside the accountability system that growth touches, from the academic growth indicator to the growth of the lowest quartile, the EL progress, and also just down to a little bit into the weeds with the student growth percentiles and the student growth target. Those are all elements that we'll want to think about as we consider the accountability use of growth measures. And also, we want to just find out from you, what type of analysis have you been doing to help inform any policies related to the impact of COVID-19 in your districts in schools?
So one other thing, Leslie, we should say that Damien and Adam did do some analyses. I'm trying to think of which state. It wasn't Utah, where they did this dropping out a year. Colorado. They dropped a year. Yeah. They dropped a year out, and as you might expect with something as robust as this quantile regression, the results looked okay. The correlations between the dropped out a year and the full continuum were pretty close. But it's always that tension of like how close is close enough, and that's only looking at it overall. So I haven't seen the results of if they disaggregate it by certain types of schools or subgroups, or there's certain ones who are disadvantaged or advantaged, things like that. So
yeah, you should. Yeah. I think Damien and Adam will probably be publishing that soon. So
yeah, especially if I nag them enough. Leslie will tell you I'm constantly harping on the staff that we got to get stuff out faster and faster because people are planning every day. So what do people have a chance to weigh in here on any of these questions, or is it just too soon? You need to actually see the analyses, but it's always good to think about, like, a priori criteria, but like, so if I said the student growth results were correlated 0.9 if I drop out a year and don't drop out a year, would I feel comfortable going forward with using growth in 2021? Or do you think that the 2020 year is so different that it would really throw things out of whack? So it's a good chance to weigh in. And I don't see any hands raised. So if you want to just jump in, jump in.
So Scott, while the group's thinking about questions, Leslie, I wasn't clear if you were making a recommendation on some of these prior slides where we're at now on what the center recommends in terms of.
No, there wasn't any specific recommendation. It more was just a summary of what's in Damien's blog. So really, some of the principles, I guess, that Damien and Adam have outlined are things that I think. Yeah. So these ideas that they've outlined, especially on the under here, I would say these are probably things that you probably want to do at a bare minimum, just kind of get a gauge of what it is. And certainly, like, they're already doing it for some other states, so it's probably not too difficult for them to do it if the data are available. So, it's really just a summary of what's in Damien's blog, and really want to get APAC's take on how they feel about it, or with their additional analyses that would be informative.
Yeah, and considering that Utah, one of Utah's assets is that the language arts and math standards and assessments have not changed since 2015, maybe 14. Considering that that's an asset we have that other states don't possess, does that change the center's position on a recommendation for us regarding this?
Just makes it more doable because you have good data.
Yeah. The other thing to point out is, with the whole 2019, this particular slide, you notice we actually intentionally jumped over 2019, but you will recall that we did there was a set of analysis that we helped conduct with the help of Aaron and Michelle on the impact of the assessment transition on growth. And there was a methodology that was applied there that obviously we went through our TAC with, but also there was some sort of I don't say if we came out with criteria necessarily, but this analysis did ultimately inform policy decisions. So Utah also has that going for itself, is that there is actually, and recently, even though it was planned to be conducted anyways before all the Questar disruptions, but it turned out to be one that serves multiple purposes and may have applications here as well. As this is truly just another disruption, not just, but it is another type of disruption that we can use growth, that may impact growth.
So I don't see any questions. So if there's no questions, we can keep moving, I think.
Yeah, okay. I think
good.
Yeah, I think at a minimum we would look at a comparison between 2019 and 2021, calculating growth with that gap year to say simulated gap year like 2016 to 2018, and see how disparate are those two in comparison. But as Leslie has mentioned, 2019 has some interesting issues of its own, so those might be difficult to tease out as mitigating factors in that analysis. But we would, at minimum, be looking at comparing a growth with the gap year to a prior calculation of growth with the gap year.
Right. So we'll certainly work with Aaron and team to do this here in Utah, so we can at least have a sense of what it looks like. But the challenge, of course, is we could drop out 2017 or 2016, but and when we look at what the 2-year growth is, the year in which would be the criterion year, whether it's 2018 or whatever it is, was quote unquote normal. Or the dropped year was normal. The thing we don't know is when we do from 2019 to 2021, what's the effect of how the results look when we have this not normal year? And so that's the part we just can't answer with the analyses. We could actually now that I think about it, Leslie, think about this for a second. What if we sort of do like a little simulation and sort of just like lower the scores? We have to think about it. We wouldn't want to do it just uniformly, but for the year that is dropped, if we played it, let's say we dropped out 2017. So we went 16, 17, 18, drop out 17. And then I don't have to think about this. We have to like treat it like it was a bad year. It's hard to simulate this, but I'll think a little more about this. Sorry, you guys have to have a little walk inside my mind. But
no, you are thinking along the same lines, and I think that's certainly something Damien and Adam is thinking. And I actually, the more I actually think about it, some of the things we did, for 2019, specifically to analyze the impact of the transition, a lot of it probably does apply here. And actually, I guess what's nice is the analysis has already been set up along with. There wasn't really any simulation done in that case, but that's certainly something one can consider in that. So I'm thinking kind of, Darren, to answer your question, I think what we could say is and of course we'll bring this up with the TAC in the next 2 days as well. As potentially we could come up with an analysis plan to propose to, first of all, to obviously to the department, and ultimately it could be circulated with this group and to find out how do we have all the bases covered. So actually do come up with an official kind of recommendation for you about the analysis that can be conducted. And then we can go from there.
Yeah, we certainly have been thinking about the large amount of work that we did to analyze growth for 2019 to determine the defensibility of its use. And if replicating those kinds of analyses would be appropriate in this case. As you mentioned, Leslie, we have some practice. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to keep us moving, Darren, unless you have another recommendation.
No, I don't have any more questions on this. If our group's silent, we'll assume they don't either, and we can move on.
So, and Michelle, this one's yours as well.
Okay. So as part of the documentation that was sent out, I had created kind of a crosswalk of the federal accountability waiver and what that means for school reporting. So you can go to the next slide. That document goes through and states the section of ESSA that falls under the waiver, and those and then I've outlined those sections that don't for reporting. So the waiver covered the achievement indicator, the growth indicator, our growth at the lowest quartile indicator, which is one of our school quality and student success indicators. The EL progress indicator is technically waived, but we do have a complete data set. As we discussed earlier, our WIDA testing was completed prior to the school dismissal, so we do expect to have a complete data set for WIDA in the next few weeks here. Other things that were waived, that were included in the federal waiver, were comparisons of school to districts to state. Those comparisons, if you can't calculate school, obviously school comparing to district and state is also not able to be done, required by the law, so that falls under the waiver. The disaggregation of student group performance and the long-term goals for ESSA also fall under the waiver. So what does not fall under the waiver is the graduation rate requirement, the readiness coursework, and post-secondary enrollment. That's the USHE data, the percentage of students who enroll in a college or university in the year after graduation. As you can see, I've noted that all of those are going to be reflective of the 2019 cohort, and so shouldn't be impacted in the 2020 report card year. We will see that impact show up in 2021, and I am hearing discussion about the need for waivers for 2021. Scott may have more information about that, but we will see some of these lagged effects certainly continue into 2021. Other things that are required because they did not fall into the waiver are under a section called other information that states provide to schools that is helpful, and for us that includes our self-reported indicators and a few other things. The school discipline data is not covered by the waiver, but that is reflective of the Civil Rights Data Collection 2018 data set. It should be not impacted by COVID-19, as well as teacher experience. We're required to report the number of teachers with emergency credentials, or the number of teachers teaching outside of their certification, and some information on teacher experience. So what's highlighted here is the information you should expect to see on your school report card. I see Leanne has a really important question about consistent attendance in the chat. Consistent attendance in school finance. School finance is on a little bit different calendar, but school finance has serves as a good example. They've already adjusted their calculations for average daily membership to be to only count the days that schools were in face-to-face session. So one question that I have for the AAPAC is it a more fair calculation to truncate the consistent attendance calculation to those school days that were face-to-face from the beginning of school to that March, I believe it was 16th to 18th that schools went into soft closure? Should that be the total days for attendance, for the attendance calculation for this year? I'd like to hear some input on that. The other thing that I would like to hear some reflection on from this group is, as I've mentioned, graduation rate will show up in, the impacts will show up in next year's report card for 2021, reflecting the 2020 grad cohort. I'm very curious in what you've seen on the ground in your schools with graduation rate, because we hear things like students who went dark during the soft closure, students perhaps at disproportionate rates in different student groups not completing their graduation requirements. And if we might see some pretty interesting impact for graduation rate for 2020, that would come into play for 2021 reporting. And we do plan to do some analysis around that, but I want to hear kind of what's your anecdotal take on that.
So Rich said attendance for him was calculated pre-dismissal. I don't know if others want to weigh in on that. Looks like we got a question from someone in the chat. Hang on. Oh, I don't see it. Okay.
So the two questions are, do we truncate consistent attendance and also FAY, full academic year essentially? And what have you observed for graduation, and have you seen any impact in student groups graduating?
This is Aaron Bruff from Data and Statistics. By the way, I just wanted to add on the attendance calculation. We're as we're doing this discussion, we're also talking about the actual ADM calculation and how that's going to work. And I'm guessing that that might have an impact on the full academic year calculation component. And just simply, what would that, the calculation as we run and do the, again, the attendance, it's the inverse basically of the chronic absenteeism. Again, we're going to be looking at that in depth, and as decisions are made moving forward with how finance is going to be doing the calculation. So again, as most of you know, we require 180 days. With this disclosure, we're looking at something like 145 days, or something of, in that range, would be credited as a full academic year. And how that's going to play out with the attendance, I'm not exactly sure. It'll probably look quite similar, simply because attendance looks at if I missed 10 or more days after I've hit it's the 60 calendar day mark that we start doing those calculations on students. And then just sharing on the graduation rate, we don't know yet what that will be looking like for the 2020 year. Obviously, we already have the 2019 data in there, as Anne Michelle's already stated. Not expecting, obviously, an impact there. As we did meet with the IT counterparts from all the districts about 2 weeks ago and talking about that information, again, there was concerns saying, do we have enough time to get all that information in there because of the pandemic? For the most part, everyone that I've worked with are in agreement that, yeah, keep the rules all the same as we move forward and say it's at end of September 30th, that is the deadline to do that final update submission on did that student graduate or not. We're not planning on changing that at the moment. What kind of impact that's going to have, again, unsure. I haven't heard directly from any assessment director or superintendents, individuals concerned about a high impact on that. So I'm guessing at this moment the graduation rate should look about this, again, the same as we move forward. So again, just sharing, that's the information I have.
Thanks, Aaron. Looks like Ogden School District has seen an increase in their graduation rate. Thanks, Rich, for putting that in the chat box. Kenyon District has some concerns, and then Weber School District, it looks like there's too many incompletes to really know at this point. And then Kenyon has agreed with Weber District as well regarding attendance for the upcoming year, which Anne Michelle are referencing a discussion that's ongoing outside of this group, and that is what Aaron referenced as average daily membership and policies around that, and whether flexibilities need to be extended or be made permanent. Those would be decisions that won't happen inside this group, though.
Sherry brought up an interesting point about what about moving forward. Maybe this wasn't the intent of her comment, but if we were to only count face-to-face days and thinking ahead to 2020 fall and not sure what 2020, 2021 will look like, I think we would mirror the decision made for 2020, for 2021, if there were any days that students were remote learning. Again, if we were back to a soft closure situation, we would likely apply the same logic. And Kurt's mentioned, looking at redefining what is attendance. I think that's a really great kind of philosophical question. Under ESSA, the requirement is to report chronic absenteeism. And we've chosen to report the inverse of that as consistent attendance. But really, the requirement is chronic absenteeism. And so how do we accurately and also, I want to say, ethically calculate students who are chronically absent with so many mitigating circumstances and such an interesting set of conditions that we're in. So graduation, I'm just kind of summarizing what I've been able to read, but it seems like it varies and won't be sure. But we'll look closely at it when we receive those graduation counts again in October, especially at specific student groups that were impacted, rural communities also, and perhaps unexpected impact that we couldn't have predicted. But also, I think there's a general consensus that we need some flexibility for that chronic absenteeism calculation, and that there's a favorable response to truncating that to days that the school was in session face-to-face. Is that?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle.
Good. Okay.
So, anything else on this slide, or you feel good?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So, Dr. Thornston. Jennifer, you might, I don't know if you're on mute or not.
Some days.
I know. It's probably only your first meeting of the day, right?
In fact, no.
I know. Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to hear so many familiar voices and at least see you in the chat box. For those who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Thornston, the Director of Teaching and Learning at the USBE. And just going to highlight some things that our agency or our department are working on to support in this time as we kind of all navigate together this new space. So we have a few supports we'll be coming out with shortly. None of these are actually available, so it's basically I am the tease for the day. It's getting a full tease experience as none of these are actually up and running. So with that said, just something for you to it's like a movie trailer. You'll look forward to it when it comes out. So the first one that we are developing right now is a resource hub of quality, vetted resources that we've curated and really focused on not being exhaustive, but being comprehensive in terms of quality. So what we've done is organize those around the portrait of a graduate, so the 13 elements. And so academic mastery, for example, is the first one. There'll be a number of high quality resources that various organizations have put out and our staff have curated and suggested if you were going to go to any one source in this particular area, these would be those sources. And so hopefully you'll find this resource really helpful. Some are for yourselves as district or school officials. Some are more for the educator at the classroom level. But hopefully as we move into phase 2 with summer learning and kind of addressing learning needs into the fall, these tools will come in handy. So we're just kind of creating this resource, and you've got an example of it there on the left side. This is the wellness strand. So Castle, for example, has put out a great guide in this kind of time of COVID. Specifically, that second link is really about what do we do in this remote learning space, knowing that this is potentially likely to happen again in the fall or sometime during the school year. So just kind of having our readiness levels set so that we're prepared for whatever comes at us in 2020, 2021. So that will be coming out. It will be kind of in 2 formats. It'll be like a PDF version, just a printable document with links that you can share with your educators or your administrators or whoever you find most value to these quality resources. And then we'll also build out a web page that there'll be kind of interactive tabs or links for people. So on the right side is kind of what the website experience may look up. It's just a mock-up of what that could look like. And then on the left is similar to what you'll see in the actual document that will come out. So we're calling this the Resource Hub. It's aligned to those 13 elements. So anywhere from mastery of academics to hard work and resilience and service and all of those areas. And it will help prep us for also addressing the whole child as we move forward in education, that we're moving beyond this focus only on academics, and I think many of us already were, but this document will really kind of show that we are focusing on the whole child as we move forward. So that is one document that we have going. The next one, and that one I have just like 8 more fixes to make, and then need to send it to leadership to review, and then graphic artists to make it look pretty. But I'd expect you'll see that one in the next couple of weeks. All right, moving forward. I'm going to click to my next slide. I don't have too many slides, so don't worry. One of the things that our teaching and learning staff is going to be working on over the next month or two are the critical standards for each grade and each content area. So one thing we've heard when we're going in these situations where we have to focus on the most critical and essential standards, that some of our teachers are still trying to cover the whole gamut. And with some guidance from USBE, we'd like to support our teachers. And some of you already have these, so you won't even need to worry. You're like, oh, we've already got our essential standards in all the content areas. Good for you, and we actually might be using yours to help ours. But ultimately, we don't have all our LEAs in that same space. And so to really support student learning, we're looking to develop a tool for each content area that references what are the critical standards. Like if I don't get this foundation, I'm really going to struggle later. Or if I don't get this foundation, I'm going to struggle right now. So that our teachers can prioritize learning if needed in a reduced amount of learning time that might happen in the future. So we'll release that over the summer. We'll have that kind of working and ready. Most likely I'd expect late July, early August that kind of guidance will be out for your review and use as you see appropriate. Again, not required, don't have to be the things, but we did want to kind of lighten the load for teachers as they try and navigate this new situation that we're not expecting them to teach every standard to the same level that they were before when they had kids for hours a day in front of them versus what they have now. And so trying to give some helpful guidance, especially in those LEAs that don't have critical standards already identified, of where we would spend the bulk of our time and effort with student learning. That will be coming as well. So you can look forward to that.
Hey, so Jennifer, are you guys doing this all in-house? Are you relying on stuff that like Student Achievement Partners will be putting out shortly? And
yeah, so if there are tools for math, we've been relying on they identified the critical standards years ago, right, when the standards came out. So math is already available. It's a lot of the others that an ELA, I think, will have some light lift. The Student Achievement Partners kind of did that work back in the day as well. Okay. But it's more like the arts and science and all of those that we have some unique standards in that we have to kind of come together around. So our staff will be working on that, and they might tap into others, but that will be kind of the charge in our team for the next couple of months to make sure we're ready for that support. Right. Scott, if you know of any tools, feel free to send them my way.
Well, actually, I know the Student Achievement Partners guidance is coming out. There's a new one coming out next week.
Okay. Are they doing math in ELA?
Math in ELA. That's it. Nothing with science. And I think that TNTP just put something out, but I haven't looked at that. But I'll send that to you. I'll send you the link.
That'd be great. Well, and I think the other things like some of the challenges, like in the music space, like singing digitally, and so we're working on guidance in those areas to kind of support, because in that space, teachers can kind of pick the standards, but it's more what are the instructional strategies that have to be adjusted for. So things are coming. We're trying to respond to the need as they arise. So that is that one. And then we've got one more. This one is probably the one I'm most excited about in terms of like development. So we're partnering with UEN and really talking through development of a remote learning course. And so what this remote learning course is kind of thinking about what are the kind of critical instructional principles you need to think about when you're in a remote learning environment. And so we're developing kind of these different modules that teachers can kind of self-pace through. They can even pick, like, I just want to go into this piece of this module, so that they don't have to take the full battery if they don't want to. If there's a certain area that they really are like, I need to know more here, that they can dive into. And there's 8 principles. And let me pull up and see if I can share my screen with you all on this, because I think it's a little mind map. Actually, it's in my notes. One second. To kind of show you what the course content is going to be in this space. just given if we go back into remote learning or any kind of blended experience, our teachers did a lot of figuring it out, but there are still a lot of things to be attended to have high quality instruction, that we don't have as many significant learning gaps that we're likely to have this time around. So with that said, let me find it real fast.
I don't know if, Emily, do I need to do anything to let Jennifer share if she wants to share?
Okay.
I'll stop sharing. There we go.
It's this one. Yeah, okay. Accept invitation. Let me see if it works. And it's still a work in progress. We just started on this a couple days ago to kind of try and, not a couple weeks ago, to start thinking about what are the needs, how do we help teachers in case this comes again. Let's be prepared. And even if some of it doesn't need to happen, a lot of it we can repurpose for blended learning or competency-based personalized learning. And so the lift won't be totally exhausted even if this never happens to us again. So let me share. Let's share this. It's going to look like a hot mess. Just know it's not a hot mess. It's a thoughtful experience. So we're going through thinking about, can you see it okay?
Yeah, it looks like a big flow chart, right?
Like a mind map.
Yeah,
It's what I can explain it as. But there's these key elements. So things like social emotional learning, what are the things to be attending to in that remote learning space? Instructional time. How much time should our kids be on? How much, focused learning time can they do at different age spans based on the body of literature? We're kind of digging into that right now. What about synchronous versus asynchronous, knowing that not all our families have a digital tool for every kid that they have at home during a remote learning experience. And so helping our teachers to think about, you can do synchronous experiences, but you also need to record those and have those asynchronous in case a kid can't get on at the time that you orchestrate the class live. So just some of those thoughtful pieces to help our teachers have a better experience with their students if this happens again. And then connections to families and students, having some things in place, like what does communication look like moving forward, to be really clear. So we've got just different pieces. Also, student engagement aligned to the standards. This is where some of those focus standards concepts comes in, as well as some other pieces. Feedback on student work. How do you give feedback? How do you get feedback from kids to adjust your instruction in the digital learning environment? And lots of other pieces, but that's kind of where we are right now. Just kind of mind mapping this out, thinking what does UEN already have that we can leverage? So what are the tools we can use from a digital learning space in remote learning to help our teachers, like, oh, you want to learn better how to use this tool, go to this course. And they've opened a lot of their courses up to be MOOCs. If you're not familiar with those, basically anybody can go in at any time and kind of go and learn. And so having this on-demand experience. And so right now we're building this out more in what are the design principles around remote learning, with the opportunity to kind of phase this into distance, blended learning or other types. Because even if we come back full-time, maybe not all the kids can come, and so we're staggering the schedules. There's still going to be this need for the distance part to happen potentially. So we're just trying to provide supports for LEAs. Any questions as I ramble on?
This is Board Member Earl. Hi, Jennifer. I'm so glad to hear some of these key things that I'm hearing both from parents and educators. Some districts are already addressing this, and the time frame was one of those that I think was probably one of the biggest things. Age appropriateness, how long should they be on, that kind of a thing. And so really hitting those skills that you want to hit, and the extra stuff, it just doesn't, you don't have to do time fillers, right?
Yes.
So I just
little kids 6 to 8 hours a day in front of the computer. It was like we didn't give them the freedom to say not all of that's needed right now, right? And so this will help to kind of share that so that teachers feel released from, I'm expected to teach the standards, and we still are, just maybe not all of them right now.
Yeah, and that's that is a key thing, is that knowing if we're in a code red,
yes,
what are the key elements that need to be addressed, because the reality is some things, depending on a child's environment and depending on what kind of critical state their own family's in, health-wise or otherwise, some things are not as important as other things, even though they're all important and we know of everything, right? There are things that are key for kids in order to move forward.
Yes.
Those are the things we need to make sure we're addressing and focusing. Did you say this will be through UEN? That's how they'll access this in small modules?
We're still landing on like, what does the platform look like for it? So is it modules? Is it in Canvas? If it's in Canvas, we can just put it on our USBE Canvas, but have it linked on UEN because that's where a lot of teachers go to look for professional learning. So we're still thinking about how do we lay out the content? What is the kind of platform for that? And then once we land on that, that will kind of lead to where we house it. But UEN's been our great partner because they have a lot of content already built out for distance learning and blended learning that we can leverage in this space, but there's some unique pieces as well that we need to create alongside. So we're kind of doing this partnership with them, given they have a lot of content we can use, but we've got some new things to build too.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one that's coming to the board tomorrow for you all just to be aware of that we've been working on is that reopening guidance. Like what does school look like in the fall, depending on the phases of risk? And so this particular document will be reviewed by the board tomorrow. So if you're interested, it's near the end of this board meeting tomorrow. But just some kind of key principles to be thinking about. A tool that we're building off of this is a planning template. Like what are the things to think about in the red? What are the things to think about and be prepared for if we're in orange? And what are the things to think about if we're in yellow? And being ready to be able to phase in and out of those at any time, because those phases of risk may change in any particular county at any time. So we're just trying to produce some things to really be thoughtful about, okay, if we're in red, that means this. What are the parent communications we need to have in place? What are the things we need for students in place and all of those pieces so we can be better prepared? I mean, all of you figured this out as you went, and I'm sure if you did it again, you'd have some ways to kind of be changing how it went the first time, but the miracles you all did this initial run through were amazing, and we're just trying to put out tools that might be helpful as we continue in this space. So the last piece that I wanted, and you'll be able to see this, and I can actually link it because this is a public document.
Hey, Jennifer, while you're doing that, Brent had a question. Brent's a high school teacher on AAPAC. He asked, who's determining what's an essential standard? It's not each individual teacher, right? I assume that's a much larger discussion.
Correct. So this will be just guidance from USBE. So it'll be our specialists leading the work of identifying those in partnership with LEA educators and such. But yeah, teachers ultimately have the right to pick what that looks like, but we will provide guidance that may or may not be of use. Hopefully it is useful, but ultimately teachers are expected to teach the standards. We're just trying to say, if you're not with kids as much as you expected, these are the things that if they don't get are really going to be foundational later that are going to cause major disruption to their learning phases. And so yeah, great question, especially from a teacher lens, like what does that look like? Yeah. So moving kind of through this document, this just kind of goes through what are some things to consider, like symptom checking and scheduling and transportation as we move in and out of different phases of risk. And so at the very end are the instructional structures. As we kind of think about these different phases, we may need different instructional structures that are coming to play. And so this just kind of highlights several that you may want to consider as we kind of ebb and flow in this new reality and new future of different strategies that may be effective, and to be thoughtful about, okay, if we stagger schedules, for example, and certain cohorts of kids in second grade come in, some of them are coming in the morning, the other half in the afternoon, we need to have that prepped with parents well before we actually need to move to that phase. And so having those set up, whether we need it at the moment or not, being prepared for, okay, if we have to stagger schedules because we can't have all these kids in the building at the same time, what does that look like? Having parents, know which one they'd be in and when they would bring their kids in advance so that we're ready, or at least there's some paper trail in place ready to roll out as needed so that we can be as nimble as possible. So there's just some different tools that are coming. I think I hear voices. Go ahead, board member.
Yeah, I do have a couple of questions, and this maybe goes along with Brent's question as well. I think high schoolers there would be a different expectation. when it comes to standards, because we're not removing the high school requirements, right? Whereas an elementary child in the red phase, the expectation would be different than a high schooler, right? So depending on the age, that expectation would be, at least that's the way I would see it.
Yeah, but for like a high school student, they still have to get their credits, right? But what the teacher determines is credit for that class will be the flexibility one, right? So if we're going to say we're going to need 1 English credit for this course, the teacher would say these are kind of the minimum competencies that you would need to reach in order to pass this course or get credit for this course ultimately. Or in elementary, if you don't do those things, we're likely to keep you passing on, but that's going to come to not be great in the future years either. So
I just wanted to clarify to make sure. I think there's 2 different scenarios there, right? There's things in elementary that we may say, the critical mass, the critical standards are what we're moving for here. Whereas at a high school level, just looking at a little different, it may have to, So I just wanted to clarify it on that.
It's an interesting situation. So those are just a few of the things that either the agency or teaching and learning specifically are working on with our board and their support. And this may get revised in board meeting tomorrow, but ultimately know that things are coming. We've definitely heard the call from the LEAs saying, hey, we need some things. And so these are some of those responses to what people are asking for. And so if there are other needs, always reach out to our leadership and they'd be happy to kind of consider. Once we get enough people asking for the same things, you realize, we probably need to work on that one too. And I know assessment's probably going to talk about the tool they've developed. Darren, I did send you an update. We added some from ELA and math for the formative assessment tools that you guys did for other ones that ELA and math would recommend. So just wanted to let you know, I emailed that to you just a little bit ago. That is all I have for you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Any more questions for Jennifer? Let's see in the chat.
I had one more question. Sorry. I just have a question because the document that you referenced for tomorrow only includes a yellow items on it. And you had earlier spoken about doing red, orange, green.
Yes.
Is that forthcoming for tomorrow, or I guess maybe
tomorrow? That'll probably be next week. So this guidance they wanted more urgently. The planning template that I was talking about it takes a little more bandwidth.
Yeah.
And so we've got a draft going, but that will probably be your next board meeting. You'll probably see that one.
Okay. I just wanted further clarification on that. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone else? Any other questions for Jennifer? No. Darren, I think it's to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer, for giving us your time today. You've had a busy day. She actually started her day, she and I communicating while she was on an airplane, flying from somewhere back to Salt Lake City. So
it's fun flying in COVID, everyone.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
So along with the supports that the State Board of Education and their staff are trying to put in place for LEAs moving forward, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about supports related directly to assessment. Jared Wright and Kim Rathke in the Assessment Accountability section have been working with our vendors. We've been communicating with our assessment directors over the last several months to try to get input from them of what tools they believe would be most beneficial. As we transition to them, I want to go back to a comment that Brent put in the chat box earlier, which I think is, there's lots of really powerful comments in there, but the one related to what we're going to talk about next, he mentions that data is only valuable if it informs instruction. So his teacher lens, in the context of looking at when students come back to school, in whatever venue that looks like, what's most important to a teacher, Brent does a good job of articulating that the data needs to be actionable for a teacher, both understanding what the student knows and doesn't know, and helping to inform the teacher what learning progressions need to be built in place to get to the place that the student needs to be at the end of the next instructional cycle. Just about in the same place in that chat box, Rich identifies as a superintendent. He's got a different need for looking at student data. and Logan would probably add to this, they have responsibilities to evaluate programs and try to reallocate resources to meet the needs of students who have fallen behind or have not been able to keep up or disadvantaged in some way, and also to meet the needs of our students who are doing okay, but we need to help stretch and expand their learning opportunities the same way we do every other student. So we're going to talk a little bit now about some of the tools, and Scott Marion also mentioned in the chat box a paper that's going to be released soon, as Rich was chatting back and forth with him, and it's going to have a lot more detail about the different audiences and the types of assessments and the decisions that need to be made really at the local level. But Jared or Kim, I don't know if you want to jump on together, or which of you wants to go first to talk about some of the changes that we're trying to, or flexibilities we're trying to support the teacher first with their responsibilities as students come back into their learning settings and instructional cycles, and then also perhaps to talk about some of the needs that policymakers have with this data. So,
can you hear me?
Yep.
This is Jared. Hi, this is Jared Wright with the assessment, and hopefully everything works and I'm not sounding too funny. I'll just start off, and then Kim can follow me. So I want to talk about, well, I'll start off with our high school. So for the Utah Aspire Plus, we have, that's our summative, but we have a high school core benchmarks. And Rebecca Peterson has been working with Pearson, our vendor for those. They are currently available, so they've extended the window for the 2019 and 2020 school year until July 5th. So they're available for use right now. We've also continued or are working with Pearson to continue the rostering. So as students come and go in those classes, or depending on how schools want to do any kind of summer during that phase 2, those are available until July 6th, and then they go off for about a week, and then July 13th they come back on for the 2020-21 school year. So those are the high school core benchmarks available. For high school, for the Utah Aspire Plus and the high school core benchmarks, we've also, we're starting discussions about virtual proctoring with Pearson and looking into what the options are for, so that's school. For our RISE benchmarks and interims, I'll let Kim talk to several of those since she leads that. But one of the things that we've been working on, which happened prior to COVID, is we've been working with Utah Virtual Academy to pilot virtual proctoring to see how that would work with the RISE benchmarks. We did that at the end of April and felt it was pretty successful, though there were some concerns that we want to make sure we address if we open it up to a bigger group. But we feel like it has potential. And so that's one thing is I've been working with Kim and with Sid Carter, put together kind of a summary of that virtual proctoring for the RISE benchmarks. And hopefully we can get that out to the board and whoever else needs it to be able to move forward with virtual proctoring as we move into the school year for 2021. Kim, you want to take over?
Here I am. I think you
There
can
you
hear me.
go. Yep,
Okay, there we
you're
go.
good.
Yeah, it always takes a second sometimes when Jared and I are being 3 counties away. So the one thing that we're pretty excited about is the fact that we've been able to work with our vendor CAI to provide below grade interim tests for the first time. Normally our interim tests are only at the normal grade, at the current grade level, but next, for starting August 11th, teachers will be able to give a classroom interim test at the grade below where their current students are, of course, for math and ELA. There are no science interim tests. The benchmark formative tools will be available August 11th as well. Both of those are the earliest we've ever had them available for everyone, and it's a really big deal to be able to do that, because some of our year-round schools and some of our LEAs are starting earlier this year, just in case we can get some additional support right at that time. The off-grade interims, I've had a couple questions. Some people have asked, are off-grade interims going to be able to be given at the same time as current grade interims? And yes, that's one of the arrangements that we've made with CAI, so that it won't interfere, because normally we can only give an interim test at the same level. The virtual proctoring thing that we've been working on actually went pretty well. Like Jared said, we have a pretty extensive document. One of the big questions we have, of course, is test security, and that's one of the things we're still working at with them. And we're happy to answer any questions about that if you have any. Our formative tools, Utah Compose is still going to be available, and also we have UTIPs, and we have a couple districts who are looking into that as well. We're working with our developer right now with UTIPs. We have upgraded our equation editor. We've upgraded item types. We've already done all of the alignment in the item banks, so that the ELA, math, and not science is still out there because we just changed standards, are available, as well as all the other UTIPs, and those are available for students grades K-12. The other thing is the work that I've been doing, and reading the chat box makes me happy, because like Logan knows and Kurt knows, formative assessment is very near and dear to my heart. And when we first went under lockdown for COVID, the first thing that hit me is the idea of learning gaps. And one of the things that I've studied over the last 6 years a lot is learning progressions. And so that's one of the focuses that will be happening from assessment for the next year. Because like Brent said, we use assessment to inform instruction. But what happens is that a lot of teachers can look at data and they're not really sure what exactly the gap is that's missing. And so we're going to be working with that a lot on learning progressions. And I presented that at the last AD meeting. I will be finishing the initial presentation of that on June 18th. I'm working right now to try to decide the platform that we're going to use this, so that it's available for everybody, including teachers, coaches, everyone. I'm also doing the same thing, believe it or not, with Utah Compose with my husband, who uses it all the time. Since he's a digital literacy teacher, we're discussing right now how we're going to film some online training that will make that available to everyone now that he's done teaching for the year. And so that's one of the two things that we've been working on. So as far as and also both Sydney, myself, and Tracy Gooley from our department have been working on the P20 competencies. All of us have had a lot of input on those as well, through different platforms and different competencies. So we've had a lot of work. In fact, some things that we're not necessarily expert, but we've been able to help provide some USBE in there as well. So we're pretty excited about that. I'm noticing in the chat box a lot of people are talking about the online, like WGU is doing virtual proctoring, precision testing, and CTE did some virtual proctoring. There were a few skills tests that were able to be given. None of the ones that my husband taught they did. WGU does, the colleges have a different system because they are adults. And so what we're trying to do is work with CAI to make this in the platform, so we do not have to contract with a third-party proctoring system. And so that's one of the things, because they are very expensive. And so what we did with the virtual proctoring, Brent, since you're asking about it, is we actually watched them give the test to 5 students over Zoom in separate breakout rooms. It was very interesting and challenging for the teachers. We had 4 proctors, and so it was a really interesting procedure to watch 4th graders do that in both math and ELA.
And then we watched a 7th grade science class do it as well in the afternoon. So that was also interesting. And I think that's everything I have. Jared, did you want to put that formative tools document that we worked on maybe in the chat box so people can see it? We sent it out in the last AD memo. I was going to look it up while we were doing this, but I thought maybe you had the link closer. But we did send out the formative tools. It actually has a detailed list on when things are available, if anybody's curious. Any questions? Any more questions?
Yeah, just real quick, this is Jared. So I don't have the link, and I know Darren sent it to our communications team, so I'm not sure of the final copy. I also wanted to add, as far as virtual proctoring, we are looking at various options and appreciate any feedback or insights as you've shared in the chat. I know I've also been looking at for our dual language immersion schools, the Apple test is being offered by LTI in different states as a virtual option. So we're also looking. So we're trying to look into various options around virtual online proctoring. But as Kim mentioned, a lot of that relates to security of both the test as well as for student data privacy. Okay. And I think that's it from me. I'd be glad to share the document that I have in draft as far as the virtual proctoring summary if people are interested.
Thank you, Jared and Kim. Appreciate your work on this and the time you put in creating these tools in preparation to help our schools, our teachers and principals, local education groups transition through the upcoming phases. Scott, there's an item on the agenda that we skipped through. We didn't have a slide for it, and I'm glad we have time left in the meeting. It's back up under the section right before LEA supports, and it's I'd hope to spend some time today reviewing and discussing opportunities for improvement to Utah School Accountability System. When we planned for this meeting, we talked about some of the written work that your staff has put together and posted online about these ideas. And Logan had a comment mentioned it's a tremendous opportunity for us to reimagine assessment to inform instruction. And I think Logan used the term, it might be too bold. And that's possible, but in this type of setting, if bold things are going to happen, they usually start with small groups of people who are able to formulate those ideas and then advance the work. And we know that there's lots of barriers. Remember Earl referenced one of those early on in our meeting today, the ESSA requirements around assessment, accountability, and reporting. And so we can get caught up in those pretty easily. But I'd like to have some discussion with this group. And Scott, maybe you can guide us a little bit too in relationship to some of the things that we could be considering through this as an opportunity at the state level for sure. And maybe to join ranks with other states eventually to push for reforms at the federal level that might be able to come out, innovations and reforms that might be able to come out of our current circumstances related to assessment and accountability.
Yeah, I think, let me see make sure I'm there, okay. It's important to both consider assessment and accountability together and then also think about them separately. And so in terms of assessment, Logan put something in the chat about this, and something that a lot of folks are, recognizing that, if your entire assessment enterprise, or what counts in terms of assessment for monitoring or only comes from a single end-of-year assessment, then you have a single point of failure, as we've seen this year. In addition to the issues of system issues and not being able to, serve multiple purposes with a single assessment by definition. And so I think folks are really taking seriously opportunities for more balanced systems of assessment, more informal assessments. They're realizing in some ways how hard it is to do online, right? Because you you can't always see kids' reactions or eyes or faces. So people are coming up with some clever ideas through exit tickets, chats, all sorts of stuff as ways to try to gather, formative and in the moment data from kids. So I think that we're seeing some things, and Jennifer mentioned this as well, is, there is this quote unquote personalized learning movement, and it doesn't mean just parking kids in front of computers by any stretch of the imagination, but it does require some kids to do some things more on their own than others, and we're seeing some of those opportunities. So it would be a shame if some of what we're learning about how to engage kids in their own learning gets lost out of this. The accountability side is, a little trickier, because accountability is generally imposed by higher ups. So certainly some assessment requirements are as well, but in terms of accountability, between federal and grading schools, they're pretty stringent requirements. But could we envision a way that we think about, I'll just give you my long-time dream that is, I've been pitching this one, tilting at windmills about this one forever. But, what if every school district had to submit its accountability plan to the state, have to have a theory of action behind that plan, and then they had to identify their goals that, we want to get better at improving kids' critical thinking skills, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is the evidence we're going to collect, and this is the criteria we're going to use to determine whether or not we're meeting our goals or close to our goals. And then you could have peer review panels of the state review the plans, and then everybody's accountability system is really tailored to them. Now, I know a lot of people think that's crazy talk. It's certainly not going to fly in the federal system now, but states should be more adventurous than the feds, because they're not tied to these congressional mandates, so they could actually have the opportunity to explore this and some ways teach the feds that. So, we're working on lots of things that how to improve local accountability, small a accountability, so that it's not just the state saying to Davis School District, this is how you're performing, but rather it's Davis School District telling the state, this is how we're performing, and here's the evidence for it. So Darren, you set me up here. I could ramble on this for the next 2 hours, so I won't torture everybody. But, we're looking for folks to say, what would be, and it's not soft accountability. It's not like, all right, it's not like T-ball and everybody's a winner. It's how do we think about doing this in a way that's in some ways scientifically falsifiable. So I say, these are my goals in my district. This is how I'm going to measure them. And this is the criteria I'm going to use to evaluate them. It shouldn't be that everybody gets a participation trophy. It should be, they should be the kind of goals and measures where people actually could fall short. And that way, that's where we have credibility. Not saying we want people to fall short, but that's how we build the credibility into that is truly holding people locally accountable. Darren, I don't know if that's at all what you wanted me to say, but I just, like I said, I could ramble on this forever.
Well, yeah, it caught my attention when I read some of the work that your staff had done. And it's a difficult concept to really get our minds around because of the restrictions that are I guess I'll use the word restrictions that are placed on us from entities outside of us, whether it's the federal legislature, state legislature, whether you're a school district and it's the State Board of Education. But I do agree that as you think about the experience we're currently in, the number of waivers that have been granted at the federal and state, local levels, I'm sure, really expose, we have these requirements that are now waived temporarily. Right. That were in place for a reason, and they were in place because we believe they provided structure and a framework to try to ensure success for all students or for significant groups of students. And we know that education in America is in our communities has areas to improve, and that we have students whose needs we don't fully meet. And so again, I'd be interested in feedback from this group as well. Some of your thoughts and ideas. I appreciate you, Scott, leading us off, and especially relevant because you get to interact with states across the country. You also interact with the people in Washington, D.C. at the Department of Ed and other entities. So your perspective is one that we don't have here in Utah without you sharing it with us, some of the information that you see. So it's really valuable, I think, for us to hear your comments and inputs around these issues that all of us across the country are facing and trying to figure out solutions to. But again,
I welcome people's ideas. There's a lot of people here who have been thinking about this locally. What kinds of things that you'd want to hold yourself accountable for, or how you'd like to assess differently. Okay, Wayne.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hey, this is Brent. I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what I did this current year. Each year I try and take something new and apply it to my teaching. And this year I studied in depth Granite School District, and they call it proficiency. They don't call it standards-based. They call it proficiency-based grading, where proficiency equals learning. And I took that concept and I thought, okay, I'm going to apply that to my classroom. And along with that, I made the goal, how can I positively impact my juniors' ACT score? And of course, in social studies, we don't have a direct exam, but there is critical thinking, there is reading comprehension. And so I came across this program from the English teachers called Common Lit. And boy, it's a real challenge for students to read those, and you can actually set it up to where they have to answer a question before they can move on in their reading, so that they learn comprehension skills. So, and if they didn't do well, I could go in and unsubmit them until they got it right. And I tried to do that with everything I did this year, in the sense that a lot of the things that I traditionally gave grades for, like watch this video and you'll take notes on this piece of paper, or bring a box of tissues and you'll get some extra credit. All that was thrown out the window. But initially, based on a rubric, I did do things like Cornell notes. I did the Freyer method. I did an assignment I call connections, where they have to connect all the different terms in a particular unit and make it a whole. And then I challenged them to come up with their best way. What is the best strategy for you to learn? And all assessments became the mark of that. And I found that the confidence is best built by competence. That when a student becomes competent, when they learn how to learn, and they can then be successful, that the assessment is no longer this big scary thing. And so, that's some of the things I learned this year. Now, how that relates to what we're doing here, I'm not a science teacher or a math teacher, but I do like to think in such a way as, okay, here's our problem. What is the solution? Did we solve the problem? And so when we look at our assessments and we look at the data from the assessments, that's why it bothers me so much that there was not a single discussion about our previous year's assessment at our school. And so I see that this, if we can establish a baseline, if we can do the assessment, let's do whatever we need to do as far as social distancing, whether we do it virtual or whether we do it in person. Let's establish that baseline, and then let's look at that growth still, because that's what I'm most concerned about as an educator. Are my students growing? Am I making a bigger impact than what they could get by sitting in front of a computer and just doing it themselves? And that's what's important to me. We know how to do it, but we're not getting it done all the time. And I know I ranted, but those are my thoughts.
Thanks for the rant. I love rants. Darren or anyone else want to jump in?
Guys, just given a little more wait time.
Yeah,
I think we've
good.
had some other comments that will surface here.
And I think Jennifer wrote a great rant. It does fit in the competency-based framework, actually, circling back to our earlier discussion.
I was just going to jump in on that
Yeah.
exact notion, Scott. This is Logan. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this. This idea of measuring competencies is different than measuring proficiency.
Yeah.
And there's a place for proficiency measures, but that's like a little 45-minute deal at the end of the year. This competency measure, I mean, it's rubrics, it's proficiency scales, and any kind of supports that we can build around that and have it be tied to those standards that Jennifer talked about. All that will be welcome as we move toward kind of a personalized approach and giving that, really let me know where a kid is relative to a specific standard in a rubric discussion. Give me that information live as a teacher, and then I'm armed to do the personalization work that we're expecting our teachers to do. So, I mean, I'd love to see a little bit of a revision to our summative model to get us the summative type information that we need without the massive investment of instructional time testing. But then divert the rest of those resources that we used to do building common formative benchmarks and things like that to statewide support for proficiency scales and rubric models and training for teachers on consistency of application so that we have comparability across classrooms as much as possible. And we'll give up a little bit of comparability and things like that, but we have to be okay with that. If we're really looking at information for the teacher about that student, then the comparability conversation maybe isn't quite as important as we think it is. So that's, as long as we're calling these rants, that's mine.
Yeah, no, it's a great rant. And these are the sort of future-looking discussions that need to happen in this assessment work group. And I would just, stress that you can't do assessment without thinking about the accountability side, because your accountability system demands, comparability, blah, 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 and super standardization, then you're like boxed into a corner. So we have to think about both together, and that's maybe a charge for us, Darren, to think about how we kind of policy recommendations would come out of that group.
Yeah, definitely. And then the audiences have different needs, right?
Yeah.
As we talked about earlier, what you just mentioned about having real-time data, or live data, I think you called it, to a teacher, that's essential to get those results back, and to a learner to get feedback in a timely manner is really important to help me continue to improve and know that I'm going in the right direction. For a policymaker who then has to direct sometimes large amounts of resources to groups of students or programs over others, their needs for data look different. And so I think it goes back to what you're saying, Scott, earlier about just this balanced system where you can meet the needs of the various stakeholders without one stakeholder's needs overshadowing or bulldozing the needs of the others in terms of assessment and the accountability data that we get from it.
Yeah, as thinking about this, these various rants, I have a blog about this. I wrote it about 6 months ago, but we were actually, Leslie and I together, they were in Texas, went to Leslie's home territory, and one of their leaders there asked about what kind of assessment can improve teaching. And we started giving the usual answers, and we were like, wait a second, we never really think about assessments to improve teaching. We think about assessments to improve student learning or to monitor student learning. And it really got me thinking. And so, I think anything we end up focusing on needs to always come down to how do we improve learning and teaching. But it's a little different, actually, if you think about your goal. If your goal is to improve teaching, not versus to improve learning, but to make sure that you really can improve teaching. What does that mean about the nature of the assessment, the nature of the data? So I did one of those little Sunday afternoon blogs that I tend to do. This one I wasn't mad about. Sometimes most of my blogs come because I'm mad about something. This one was just because I was really curious. But it's an interesting thought experiment as we sort of move into this, thinking about long-term view of assessment and accountability. It shouldn't just be at one level. We have to think about all these different uses and use cases. So this is the right group to be involved with this. They're already ahead of us. So.
Yeah, and Scott, I would add that one of the board's strategic plan goals is personalized teaching and learning, and I've been able to be part of that to address some of these exact questions of how do you balance assessment for learning with very strict requirements for accountability, and make it meaningful, really, is the ultimate question, I think. And one thing that I observed this year when we had such a lag in reporting data to schools was the need that schools and LEAs had for consuming their own assessment data so that they could do those kinds of deep data dives and analysis. And I thought it made me reflect and wonder on that dialogue of, summative assessment, it's not helpful, but on the other hand, they really, really want that data back when as soon as possible. And so I think there's a bit of a conflict there. This is my thinking out loud. So yeah. I think there is such a thing as a balance in both, and somehow we have to reconcile that. We're not in the position of a lot of states, like DC is completely rethinking and redesigning their accountability system. Rich can speak to this, that we did that work in 2015, 2016. Scott, you were there. I think we have the bulk of what we like and what we need in our system. But certainly worth asking questions.
That's right. Yeah. Any other comments, questions, rants? We'll take them all.
I just want to respond to the person before me. I mentioned that was a member of the board. Who was that? Anyway.
Oh, that was me. I'm Michelle.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't preface that.
Okay. So what teachers don't want is the letter grade defining them and their schools. What they do want is the data to, as I said before, to inform instruction and to be able to systematically deal with the deficiencies of their students. And so we have two competing goals. We have the goal of the legislature to grade schools, and we have the goal of the teacher to use the data for a different purpose. And those two come at odds when they really don't need to. The solution has been the dashboard, but I guess that's going to go away. I hear all kinds of positive, hey, this is a good use of the data to gauge where we're at. It's not as intense as far as making us feel like we're being attacked or being evaluated, we're failures or not. So anyway, I think the data can be valuable.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm going to clarify it. I'm not aware that the dashboard's going away. So I don't know, Brian, if there's something I didn't understand there, but I do want to assure the group that the school report card or dashboard is in existence and moving forward. In fact, we have developers that are continually working on the next phase or the next element of that. The letter grade, though, was in the last legislative session. There was a 2-year waiver's not the right word, but we'll use it because waiver's trendy right now. A waiver on the Utah State Board of Education's requirement to publish overall school grades. So that has been suspended temporarily for 2 years, serendipitously into this coming year. They made that decision before COVID-19, not related to that, but it just happened to work out really well that way.
Anyone else? All right. Okay.
Other hands?
Rebecca just weighed in. I really like the idea of related to a complete and comprehensive system of assessment. Yeah. And, I will say, folks, just, it's all these things that we're talking about and ranting about, they're all hard, but it's like anything else. Anything really worth doing is hard. We've gotten the easy stuff down, and even that's not so easy. So so this is going to be, people are going to have to roll up their sleeves and work. We've been trying to crack the assessment literacy nut for a long time at the classroom level, but rebalancing the summative system helps to do that a little bit. So.
Well, I think. Oh, go ahead if there's another comment.
Yeah, are you asking for general questions, or I'm sorry, I got a phone call just a minute ago, so I apologize. Are you asking for general questions, or are you commenting on a specific item?
We're talking about how to improve the accountability, how we might use this opportunity to re-envision accountability and assessment in the state. Okay,
this question was, it's impactful here, or I think it's relevant. Specifically, I wanted to just ask a little bit of questions. So earlier you had mentioned that 5 years down the road, we're looking at making changes or thinking of assessment 5 years down the road. What is it we envision 5 years down the road? What is that we're hoping to see 5 years down the road that's such a great improvement? I'm just asking that question. What would be ideal?
I think that's the work of the group. I don't think it's for Darren or me or to say what, I give you my vision, but my job is to elicit that vision from people in the state. It has to be a Utah-held vision and strongly held values it'd be nice to actually think about doing something that's actually possible to do, that there's some research behind it or some other experiences. You're not going to say, we're going to go to Jupiter. Well, you're probably not going to go to Jupiter. So we have to think of something that's doable. But we also, it is up to the people. That's why we talked about that quote unquote Noah's Ark, People have to put forth the values. It shouldn't be us saying what the values are.
And the only reason why I ask that is because at this time of change, both in our inability to access normal assessments the way we normally would, it just seems that we're in that critical transition time, and that to continue with something and then try to change in 5 years, and maybe that's just a race dialogue. I don't know. Not that we're trying to race through anything and not be thoughtful, but the point being, we may not want to hurry to get too far into the next ship when we might be taking another ship that's sailing, if that makes any sense. So yeah. I guess I'm just like wanting us to be thoughtful enough that we're not racing to get onto something, but then we want really something else to take place so that we can maybe move more towards
I see what you're saying. Yeah, right.
Or whatever.
Right.
So I just wanted to maybe throw it out there. So we're really thinking of that and be thoughtful, not only of educators in this realm of change or whatever, but also the finances, that are associated with it too. So
to be fair, I'll take the blame. It was me who said the 5 years, but that's, it was arbitrary. And, we don't want Darren and Jared and Sid to lose their jobs if they don't have a compliant assessment system in 2022.
Right. I understand that. But at the same time, while things are moving quickly when we haven't ever seen that before, right? Who thought we could quickly get some of these things done? There might be that kind of time for, a thoughtful dialogue that could be put into place, it doesn't take 5 years. And I understand the 5 year dialogue, what you're saying is an envision for the future.
Right.
We can move that closer as we've had a disruption in such a way that we can, be productive. So
That's a great point. Yeah. Darren, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. I think today, the fact that we're finishing up at 3:41 is an example of how online learning, online meetings, online activities can sometimes be more efficient than face-to-face. When we prepared this agenda with our staff and with Scott, I think we expected we wouldn't get through it all. Is that accurate, Scott?
Well, we expected Jennifer to talk the whole time, so no, just kidding.
Yeah. So let's
Hey.
So let's look forward. Our next meeting is scheduled for September 16th from 1 to 4. We'll get that out on the calendar, but if you want to make sure you've made a note of that. So we'll be meeting at the very beginning of the school year. Before that happens, though, just to summarize some of the things we talked about today, before that happens, the work group for the strategic assessment plan will move forward. There'll be communications come out to each of you once I have more details about the commitment that it would take, that we'd be asking for you as a member of AAPAC to be part of the work group, and give you some time to reflect on that and respond. But by September, we should be well underway, and Scott, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we should be well underway into developing that long-term plan or vision of what assessment should or could look like in the state of Utah. With the goal of having that wrapped up by the end of October. We also have some questions from our assessment directors about TSI identifications that will be on the agenda in September. And then, if not done earlier, we'll review the recommendation of research analysis from the Center for Assessment that Leslie talked about earlier as we look into the near future about our needs to try to get analysis on the impact that some closures had. There'll be lots of discussion about this nationally. The NAEP is administered, I believe, in this coming school year. America's really only national assessment that allows us to compare one state to another. And there'll be a lot of interest, I would expect, on the results of the NAEP for 4th and 8th grade students that are tested, as well as other ongoing assessments. So again, I want to thank each of you for your willingness to participate in this committee to help support assessment accountability in the state of Utah, and for the time that you provided today to this discussion and the benefit that brought to all of us. So thank you.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.